My talk title is The Freedom of Spirit. And I want to start by acknowledging an Indian proverb that says we're a house with four rooms: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. I like acronyms because I like my mind to be able to remember things very easily. So pies, imagining that the pies are these different rooms that we can live in and live from. And what I want to really focus on today is that we can absolutely acknowledge all of those rooms, really honor all those different rooms, and recognize that we can ask the question, what gets created when I live in each of these different rooms? Nikola Tesla said something that I think is profound. And what he offered is very simple. The moment we start studying non-physical phenomenon, we will make more advances in a decade than we did in the previous hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. And we are at a remarkable time in the evolution of human consciousness. And it might appear that things are falling apart in some ways, or crumbling, or that fear is a part of our culture and our society. And that is true. And there's also a greater reality. And that greater reality is as we shift our awareness from only focusing on the physical and start to look at the metaphysical, or the beyond the physical, which includes the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, we can actually shift our awareness while honoring what's happening in the world, but not being a victim to what is happening in the world. And this is really huge. What Ron offered us today in the reading from Eckhart Tolle is powerful. And I'm going to be paraphrasing this because that was the first time I heard the reading. But Eckhart Tolle is talking about the illusion of ego. He doesn't ever say there's something fundamentally wrong with the ego. And what is the ego? Let's take a moment with that, because in a lot of spiritual circles, it has seemed to be true that we have wanted to get rid of the ego. But I actually don't think the intention is to be rid of the ego. The intention is actually, in my experience, to honor all parts of ourself, or the seeming parts of ourself, whether we call it the physical reality or the ego. So let's talk about it for a moment. The ego is simply the personality, the collection of thoughts, ideas, and beliefs we have about the world. We could say it's actually our physical body as well, what we can see, what we can touch, what we can taste, what we can experience with the five senses. This is what lives in physical reality. Nothing wrong with that, nothing bad about that. Many of us have been conditioned to have polarized thinking. You know, we have been using the term we are in a polarized society, or our country, talking about the United States, is polarized. And I actually don't think that's true. I think that we could point to evidence to support that. What I think is actually true is that we have been conditioned to have polarized thinking. We have been conditioned to look at the world through the lens of good, bad, right, and wrong. All of that lives in the ego, and all of it, it's not that we want to pretend that it's not happening. We can recognize that it is an experience, but only a small part of the experience. And I love what Asher said earlier about the choice of what we focus on. It's not that we need to be rid of the ego, or that the ego is bad or wrong, or that my ideas or my thoughts or my beliefs are bad or wrong. It's just exploring through curiosity what gets created when I live from and as these different rooms, or these different levels of awareness. What gets created when I believe I am my opinions? What gets created when I believe I am my beliefs or my ideas about myself and the world? And what else is possible? And what is my choice? And going back to what Tesla said about non-physical phenomenon, be with that for a moment. Really lean into that as my invitation for you this morning. What might that mean? What might it mean for me to start studying or measuring non-physical phenomenon? Perhaps it's an emotion. It's the sense of love that I feel when I'm around a community where there's this frequency or this vibration of love. Perhaps it is moving beyond just the physical or the five senses and start to look at a greater possibility. We are living in a time where we are being literally fed a news cycle that's now 24/7. If you're of a certain age, we didn't have the news 24/7. We had the newspaper. We could pull out at any time and read the news. But we had, what was it, the 6 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news? But now it's constant. We have social media. We have new 24-hour news channels that we can turn on and we can hear the stories. What are the stories that are primarily being delivered on the news? Or as my friend Michael Beckwith says, it's not the news, it's the olds. It's the same old story of division, of separation, and of fear. And again, I want to be clear, we're not making that wrong or bad, because that's actually just living in the ego paradigm. There's something wrong with the way the news is reporting. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is what gets created when I focus on that? What gets created when I actually have that being fed to my consciousness several hours a day, even several minutes a day? And what gets created when I unplug from that and start to look at non-physical phenomenon? Spirit. What is spirit? The essence of who and what we are. If it's true that we came into the world as a perfect expression of the one presence and the one power, and many New Thought teachings, that's the foundational principle, that there is one presence and one power. And then each of us is a perfect expression of that. Now that sounds really great, doesn't it? I'm a perfect expression of source energy. But for a moment, I want to invite you to be curious about that, to actually lean into that and ask yourself, what gets created when I know that? When I know that I'm a particle of God energy, of source energy, of essential beingness, all these words we use for divinity, for source. What happens when I really know that? And then what am I called to be or to do in the world? Wow. Lean into that for a moment. I'm not my thoughts and opinions. I'm not going to live in the paradigm of what I can see, touch, and taste. I'm going to honor that and recognize that as part of the experience. And as a master teacher over 2,000 years brought us to be in the world, but not of the world. To be of the world is to believe that the world has power over me. And we're talking about freedom today. What is freedom? I think about Nelson Mandela, who was in prison for all those years. I think about honoring Martin Luther King, whose birthday we celebrate tomorrow, who really stood for freedom. Now, I didn't have the honor of meeting Martin Luther King in person, but what's great is his teachings and his legacy live on. And he was someone who stood for freedom, not against. Now, does that mean that he didn't speak to what he saw in the world with the division and the ism, the racism? He did speak to that, but he spoke to it from a place of a greater reality, a greater knowing that it is possible for us to move beyond the divisions. It is possible for us to live beyond the appearances, the color of our skin, our age, our religion, our lack of religion, all the ways the ego uses what's happening in the world to divide. The ego is an important part of our psyche, is an important part of who and what we are. Without the ego, without the mind, I wouldn't be standing here talking. But let's back up a little. This idea of separation and of otherness came from survival. Early in the evolution, we lived in caves, and if we went outside, we might get eaten. So I need to constantly be looking at what's safe and what's dangerous. And then we would build tribes to protect ourselves from what was happening. And yes, that's the animalistic instinct of protection and of safety. And with that animalistic perspective of safety, what gets also created is the other. And then we get conditioned to believe that we need to always look at who and what is safe and who and what is not safe. And we find our people to protect ourselves from the seeming or perceived other. And so if we're going to move beyond the physical, because in the physical, we are animals, let's name it. Right? We are animals. We must eat to survive. And part of that survival mechanism, the reptilian brain, is always looking for who's safe and what is safe. Nothing wrong with that. And it's extremely limited. Because if we want to only live in the animalistic realm of reality, we are going to stay stuck in constantly needing to create safety in our lives, security in our lives. And with that knowing, with that only living in the physical, we're going to naturally create an other. That group isn't safe. That group is wrong. This group is right. Yes, we do have physical reality. But most of us at this point aren't really afraid that we're going to be eaten when we walk out of our homes. We have evolved now, and we are evolving now to recognize, yes, we have that, but it's not the ultimate truth of who and what we are. That we have evolved into recognizing that we have an intellect, we have emotions, and we have a spiritual essence that is also included in the totality of what we call human. And what we call human is changing and evolving constantly. And so we have a choice at this moment, this profound moment in human history, where there are forces, and I don't mean evil or good. I mean, there are forces in consciousness. There's a collective consciousness right now that we must be afraid. And perhaps we've moved back into focusing primarily on the physical. And so what I'm inviting for us today in this conversation of the freedom of spirit is to recognize that I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have thoughts, but I'm not my thoughts. I have emotions, but I'm not my emotions. All of that is part of my experience. And the greater reality, or maybe the greatest reality, is that as a spiritual being, I am free. And that freedom is not contingent on what I hear on CNN or Fox or what I see on Facebook or Instagram. That freedom of spirit needs nothing, because essentially we are whole, we are complete, we are spiritual essence. Knowing that allows me then to integrate the physical, the intellectual, and the emotional. This is not about rejecting, this is about including. What gets created when I shift from that paradigm with the reptilian brain of I must protect myself into a more expansive awareness of curiosity, of openness? As we dedicate ourselves to living as spirit through spiritual practice, we connect very deeply with our essential beingness. And then we can take a look at all the ways that we have believed that that's not who and what we are. Because the truth is, spirituality is not about a destination. It's about a recognition of who and what we are. And because we dedicate ourselves to spending time in the silence and making a deeper connection, and it's not really a connection because we're never disconnected, it's recognizing a greater reality, recognizing that spiritual essence is always more powerful than what we can see in the world. In New Thought teachings, we call it ultimate and relative reality. And I want to speak for a moment about something that I see happening in the world. And I woke up one day with an awareness, and that awareness was fear, and the way fear is being propagated in some way is connected with our perspective, our point of view, and our relationship with what we call death. Because what we have been hearing, and what I've been hearing a lot of my friends saying is, oh my gosh, but I might die. So here's the great news. At least this far in the evolution of human consciousness, we are going to be leaving these bodies. So far, there might be a point that we evolve beyond that. I don't know. The fear of that, or the not acknowledging that, to me creates the greatest suffering. The greatest suffering is trying to work against that. And I say this often, and I'm going to say it again. We even use the term, she lost her battle with cancer. He lost his long fight with any virus or any disease that's out there. What if there's a greater reality? It doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge and honor if I feel sad when someone dies. What it does mean, though, is the paradigm that we have created collectively and unconsciously is, oh my gosh, we must not ever die. We must not ever acknowledge it. But there is a greater reality at hand here. And that reality is the spiritual beingness of who and what we are is eternal. Now, there are some that say that may be true and that may not be true. So my invitation for you is to ask yourself that question. Do I know that I'm an essential, eternal, infinite being? Do I recognize that I have this body, but I'm not my body? Yes, I care for it. I take care of it. Maybe I look at what is safe and what isn't. There's a fundamental difference in that than what we are seeing being played out in the world. And that is this idea of good, bad, right, wrong based on people's choices. And on one hand, I just want to acknowledge and be vulnerable that it's heartbreaking to me. In my emotional room, it's heartbreaking to me that we are pointing fingers and blaming. And blame is not bad. It's just a very low frequency. Blame creates more division. It solidifies the division. It creates the other. And then we find ourselves in these camps based on what we believe or what we think. And that is the dance of the human ego that has been around for thousands of years. And what I want to ask you in closing, and then we're going to open it up for conversation. What I want to ask you in closing is, what is your role in this right now? Is there a judgment you have about the choices of other people right now? What gets created when I have this judgment? What if I don't judge me for having judgment? What if I become curious about that? Wow, I wonder where I got that idea. I wonder where I got the idea that someone is wrong or bad or good or right based on their choices they're making or which camp they live in, or whether they're wearing a piece of cloth on their face or not. And see, the human mind has been so conditioned to believe in right or wrong that this video could even get flagged for me saying that. We're in this now. This is where we're at. Collective consciousness tells us we must find our tribe, our people. Sometimes in spiritual community, we even use the term like-minded. I want to invite us into a greater paradigm, that we can move beyond that maybe we're not looking for like-minded people, maybe not even like-hearted people, but spiritual beings coming together to know a greater reality, regardless of what's happening in the world, regardless of what's happening in my families, in my life, regardless of what I see on the news or the energy I feel when I'm out in public. What if the greater reality is oneness, infinite beingness? What if we have chosen to be here right now in the midst of this, to be the beacon of spiritual essence? What would it create for me to say yes to that? To recognize that, as I said, I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have thoughts, but I'm not my thoughts. I have emotions, but I'm not my emotions. All of those are included in the totality of the spiritual experience. And in the midst of that, what I'm going to focus on today, the choice that I'm going to make, is to know that. New Thought was founded with a knowing that we can heal, that we can bend toward wholeness, that we can be spiritual essence, that we are not the conditions of the world, that in the midst of that, we have not only a choice, but I would say a responsibility. So anyone who's watching right now, if you consider yourself a part of the New Thought movement, even if you don't even know what that means, well, what is that? Because it's not actually a new thought. It's a beingness. It's a call to action, but the action is spiritual action. To notice if I am for or against. To notice if that creates suffering, or as Eckhart Tolle said, to notice if that's an illusion. It's not the truth. The new paradigm is oneness, and we have been called. So I'm inviting you to say yes. And I'm going to invite you in this moment to move within for a moment, check in with your heart space, check in with that essential beingness, and ask yourself the question, am I willing to say yes? Am I willing to be the love that the world seems to want and need so desperately right now? Am I willing to be the light that I know I've come here to be? Am I willing to move beyond the illusion of thought, of separation, of division, of fear, and step into ultimate freedom? Freedom of spirit is a great knowing. It's not a thought. It's not a feeling. It's a great knowing.